Experience counts if you're trying to get professional results quickly, and Nat Bryant has had plenty of it, including getting good-looking topsides. The video you're about to see shows how a full-time boatyard worker approaches his own boat's topsides, and does it after hours. Like us all, he wants his boat to look well, but with his eye on the season ahead, his standards can't be unreasonable. Nat Bryant learned his trade from his father Paul, who has long guided my own work in caring for wooden boats.
This is a Hinckley Pilot. She was designed by Augie Nielsen when he was working in Sparkman and Stevens' Boston office. The original Pilot was about 33 feet. This one is 35 feet. It was stretched out a bit, but it's the very similar design to the original. This is the high-speed grinder that I use to do most of the fairing on the hull with. It's a 7-inch. It's not quite as big as the 8-inch polisher, but it's still pretty effective for fairing purposes. We've got a hard pad on the back, so it flat sands very well and does any of the flat sections extremely well. And then when you get back on the curve here, you can only do it very gently and carefully. But I was able to get most of it and then finish the fairing with the polisher afterwards. I had started with a 36 grit to get most of the big humps and bumps out of the way, and then smoothed it up a bit with 50 grit, and then finally switched it over to the soft speed polisher with 80 grit to smooth it out the rest of the way. And there was a little bit of hand fairing involved, but not that much because I also wanted to go sailing this summer. With both of these machines, both the polisher and the grinder, where they spin so rapidly and can put digs so quickly in a hull, it's a good idea when you first do it to tap it up against it so you're sure it's flat against the surface, then pull it back 1/4 of an inch and then start it so that you know when you put it back on it's not going to go in at an angle and create a dig into the hull. I'm going to smooth it off here with the 8-inch with the soft pad. And the soft pad on this one is a very soft pad. They make an awful lot of different variations. Most of them are kind of firm, but we found that the really soft ones work much better with these curved hulls. With the hull all sanded, initially I had done the fairing and put 2 initial coats of paint on, and after those first two coats of paint were on, there were an awful lot of open seams and small inconsistencies along the hull still that needed to be filled in. So I used a slow drying putty, and with a 5-inch putty knife, you can use a 6-inch or whatever. It's a lot more effective than a 1-inch putty knife. But with a 5-inch putty knife, I filled in pretty much all of the seams and all the imperfections, little divots over bung holes, and anything that was visibly below the surface. With the 2 coats of paint on there, it's much easier to see what's actually a void at that point. So I went ahead with a slow drying putty and went all the way around the boat once, and then went all the way around the boat one more time because it tends to shrink into the seams quite a bit. Now that it's been sanded one more time here, we're going to vacuum it off and put 1 coat of gloss paint on and see what it looks like. There will undoubtedly be a little bit more puttying to do, a little bit more sanding to do, but it's getting a little bit smoother and more fair each time. Well, when I first saw this boat in the back of Wooden Boat magazine, it was, of course, about a 2-inch by 1.5-inch picture, so it was pretty hard to see much about the boat. But when I went down and visited it, it was obviously initially that it was going to need a lot of cosmetic treatment. You could see some of the unfair spots and some of the peeling paint and varnish everywhere. So that part was apparent, and upon deciding to purchase it, it was not too much of a concern because I knew I could at least bring the finish work back into good working order fairly easily and in a reasonable amount of time. Looking at the boat, it was a very fair boat overall. She wasn't sagged, she wasn't hogged, and it really looked like it was in pretty good shape, which was very encouraging for a 55-year-old boat. But and structurally, she was pretty sound. There were some cracked frames that had been sistered, and there were a lot of other small projects. This is a drying inhibitor that we add to a paint. The paint itself is a 1-part polyurethane high gloss paint, and we add a drying inhibitor to make it a little bit more brushable so that we can actually keep up with it and not have lap marks along the way. In order to keep the consistency the same every time you do it, pick your paint stick up out of the paint and count how long it takes from it to go to a stream to just a little tiny drip. And remember that number of seconds. We here at usually go for about a 6 to 8 second drip count for topside paint. And today I went a little too far. I went down to a 5-second drip count, so this should be plenty thin. This is just brushing. You can roll and tip just as well, which works very well, but when you're jumping around stagings, it's sometimes a lot less cumbersome to just have a bucket and a brush in your hand. So we use a 3-inch nylon polyester brush, which doesn't hold too much paint and holds a pretty convenient amount to work with and brush it on. We usually do it in about 2 to 3 foot laps. It's a pretty convenient size to work in, and that way it shouldn't get too far ahead of you. You can hold a wet edge easier. As you're painting along, you can kind of see where you're going to need to do some putting already. It'll jump out through the gloss of the wet paint. So the next step will be to come back with a little bit more putty. And then the next sanding can be a 220 grit sanding, a pretty smooth one, just to finish it off. And then she'll be ready for finish coats that will be the actual finish coats. When you dip your paint into the brush, dip it into the paint, dip it in about 3/4 of an inch or so, and that'll give you a pretty comfortable amount to work with. Put it on in the middle of the area that you're working and spread it out quite aggressively at first to cover the whole area you're working with, and then make your finishing strokes starting outside the paint where you haven't been and finishing inside the paint of the last lap where you were before. So you're covering the whole area and then some. And the quicker you're able to do it and get it feathered out, the quicker you can move on and keep a good wet edge. And those last strokes probably ought to be pretty light strokes as compared to the first strokes of spreading out the paint. Prior to all this work, after the initial fairing and sanding, I put 2 initial primer coats on just as quickly as I could after I got done sanding, so that the bare wood wouldn't dry out too much out in the open air as it is. And that was the main purpose, but it also serves the purpose of showing up the imperfections in the hull a little bit easier than it is with just bare wood. And it made putting a lot simpler. You can see what you have to be putting easier that way. That paint mix was not an actual primer, but our homemade primer of 50-50 gloss and flat. A lot of primers, flat primers, when they go on there, the gloss paint that goes on after them doesn't like to stick to it as well, so we mix a flat paint with the gloss, and it makes a pretty good base that the gloss paint will adhere to. Most of the paints that we use here are Interlux products. We've found good luck with them in the past. They level out a little bit better, and they're certainly very nice and user-friendly to work with. This paint right here is Interlux's Bright Side series. It's a 1-part polyurethane. It's a 4259 Blue Glow White, and the primer that we put on the hull was a mix of this 4259 and their 242 flat white paints put together. Well, as we're going along here, you can kind of see quite obviously spots like this over fastenings that are going to need a little bit more putty, and seams that are a little bit opened up along the cracks there that could use a little bit more putty. So it becomes apparent where that putty is going to be needed next. And this whole process that we've been doing here is really only because I initially bought the boat as is, and it was just really needing a lot of treatment. This is not a normal thing that you'd ever have to do on an annual basis, but initially, to get it fair again, it was a little bit lumpier and just really needed some smoothing up. So this is a one-time thing that hopefully won't have to happen again for 20 years.